Certainly many people out there would like to break habits they feel don't serve them well. One of the challenges in breaking habits is that many habits occur very, very quickly, and so there isn't an opportunity to intervene until the habit has already been initiated and in some cases completed. There are a couple of tools that neuroscience and psychology tell us can be very beneficial. Some of those things are somewhat intuitive and relate to what I call foundational practices, meaning things that set the overall tone in your body and brain such that you would be less likely to engage in a particular habit, or that would raise your level of awareness, both of your situation and to how you feel inside. So things like stress reduction, things like getting good sleep, things like quality nutrition, things like having positive routines arranged throughout your day. All of those, of course, will support you in trying to break particular habits. And while that can be very useful, it's admittedly very generic advice. It doesn't point to any one specific protocol. In order to identify a specific protocol that one could apply in order to break habits, we have to look at the mirror image of the sort of neuroplasticity that we talked about at the beginning of the episode. At the beginning of the episode, we talked about a form of neuroplasticity called long-term potentiation involving the NMDA receptor. Just to refresh your memory a little bit, it basically says that if a set of neurons is very electrically active, it's likely that over time, those neurons will communicate with themselves more easily because of changes in things like NMDA receptor activity, the recruitment of additional receptors, etc. It's essentially a cellular and molecular explanation for how something goes from unlearned to learned to reflexive. Now, in order to break synapses or to break apart neural connections that are serving a habit that you don't want to engage in, we need to engage the process called long-term depression. And long-term depression has nothing to do with a state of mental depression or a reduction in mood. So I really want to be clear that when I say depression in this context, it has nothing to do with psychological depression. It has nothing to do with mood. It's simply called long-term depression because just as long-term potentiation says if neuron A triggers the firing of neuron B, and it does so very robustly over and over and over again, then neuron A will not have to fire as intensely or as frequently in order to activate neuron B in the future because they become potentiated. Threshold for co-activation has been reduced. There's a much higher probability that they will be activated together at low levels of intensity. That's essentially what long-term potentiation is. Long-term depression says that if neuron A is active and neuron B is not active within a particular time window, then the connection between neuron A and B will weaken over time, even if they started off very strongly connected. And just as a point of interest, the NMDA receptor is also involved in long-term depression, although there are other molecular components involved as well. So how do you take two neurons that underlie a habit out of synchrony? How do you get them to fire asynchronously? This is pretty interesting with respect to the cellular and molecular biology, but at the behavioral level, it's especially interesting. The way that one would do this is, let's say, for instance, you have a habit of picking up your phone mid-work session. Okay, that's a reflexive habit I think that most people have experienced. And we often hear the idea that, the phone is so filled with access to dopamine and incredible things that we're just drawn to it. But if you notice what's happened with phone use over time, most people, including myself sometimes, I admit, find ourselves just looking at our phone or find ourselves in a particular app without actually having engaged in the conscious set of steps of, I'm really curious what's going on in this particular app. I'm really curious what's going on in this particular website. You just sort of find yourself doing it because the behavior of picking up your phone is sort of reflexive or has become fully reflexive. You see this a lot at meals where multiple people are there and no one's looking at their phone, and then all of a sudden someone takes out their phone and you'll notice that other people just naturally take out their phone. It's this observed, observation-induced reflex. And I would wager that most people aren't consciously aware of the immediate steps involved. The literature says there are a number of ways to break these sorts of habitual behaviors. Most of those approaches involve establishing some sort of reward for not performing the activity or some sort of punishment for performing the activity. I've heard of some basic things that people will do, like they'll even put like a rubber band on their wrist, and every time they complain or every time they do some behavior like pick up their phone, they'll give themselves a snap on the wrist. The rationale there is that you're trying to create a somatic, a very physical representation of something that makes it very real and harder to overlook. Other people will just do a tick mark on a piece of paper, the sort of what gets measured is what gets managed kind of mindset, where if every time you do something, you take away the judgment, that every time you engage in a behavior, you just measure the fact that you did that behavior. You just mark it down. At the end of the day, people are supposed to look at that and say, oh my goodness, I can't believe that I spent 3 hours doing something, or I did it 46 times. And in fact, a lot of apps, social media apps, will start to give you warnings now if you opt in that you've been on the app for an hour. Would you like to leave? Most people just click right past it and go back in. I think very few people say, oh my goodness, it's been an hour and therefore you're right. I absolutely shouldn't engage in this anymore. It's just far too easy to just blow past those reminders. The literature on habit formation and habit reduction, breaking habits, has been analyzed. There's a beautiful meta-analysis which involves looking at a number of different studies all together, comparing the statistical strength of each of those studies, looking in different conditions, what sorts of habits were trying to be made or broken. The first author on this review is Fritz. It's Heather Fritz, and it's Intervention to Modify Habits, a scoping review. And it is indeed a very broad-scale review. It's from the Journal of Occupation, Participation, and Health, published in 2020. It's a really nice article. A couple of things I learned from this article, and then I'll get into the specific tool for breaking habits. Perhaps the most interesting thing that I took from this review was the finding that notifications to either engage in habits or to not engage in habits actually were not very effective over time. They were effective in the immediate period when people started using these notifications, as were little sticky notes. Visual reminders, physical reminders, or electronic reminders were effective in the immediate term, but in the long term did not predict whether or not people would effectively stick to habits they were trying to stick to or break habits that they were trying to break.